Okay, right, we are recording. We are live from UCA, and okay, checking to see that I'm on screen. Okay, this is my very sophisticated demonstration of seafloor spreading. We have here 2 rolls of paper towels in a cardboard box. Ooh, ah. And what I've done is I've cut a slit in the cardboard box and pulled the rolls of paper towels through the slit, like so. So now we have paper hanging off either side of the slit, and we can simulate seafloor spreading by very gently pulling on the, of course it doesn't slip back into the mid-oceanic ridge, but if we pull on these, you've got a model for new oceanic crust forming along the ridge. And it's tearing a little bit. This is not working quite as well as I'd hoped. But forming at the ridge. And coming out on either side, except it doesn't rip. Okay, this is perhaps not as good an idea as it seemed. Give me a second. Technical difficulties. Maybe I'm not going to post this recording. But here. Okay, here's the paper from one roll. And here's the paper from the other roll. And there you have, imagine magma pushing up through that slit and forming new crust going to either side. Okay, that's the way seafloor spreading works. And about those magnetic stripes that we were talking about, there's a mid-oceanic ridge. Remember that when rocks form, they take on the magnetic field of the Earth for the same reason that if you stick a paper clip on a refrigerator magnet for long enough, you'll magnetize the paper clip. The paper clip will pick up the magnetic field that it's in. So let's say that we have rocks right here at the mid-oceanic ridge, and as they cool, once they get below, I think it's 600 Celsius, they will pick up the magnetic field of the Earth. And let's say that this direction is north. So there's those rocks that have just now formed, and their magnetic field is pointing north. Now a little bit more comes out, and it picks up a north-pointing magnetic field, like that. And now a little more comes out, and it picks up a north-pointing magnetic field. And now a little more comes out, and holy hominy, the Earth's magnetic field has just reversed. The Earth's magnetic field has just flipped. Well, now the new rock that's forming here at the ridge will have a magnetic field that's pointing south. And then a little bit more forms, and the new stuff will also have a south-pointing magnetic field. And then a little more forms, and holy cow, the magnetic field just flipped again. So now the new rock is going to have a north-pointing field. And then a little more forms, and this new rock will have a north-pointing field. And then a little more forms, and oh no, we've got another flip. And so on. So you see what we've got here? We've got rock that is formed, you can think of this as stripes. We've got zones of rock with a north pointing field and rock with a south pointing field. They're mirror images of each other because they're forming at the ridge and then getting pushed apart as new crust forms at the ridge. Does that help? Okay, that was a little clumsy, but hopefully it managed to get the point across. Now let's mercifully go back to the slides. Okay, admit. Okay, right. Let us commence to rock on 2 Electric Avenue and then take it higher. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about evolution. All right, I'm assuming if I don't hear anything, I am going to assume that everybody in internet land can see and hear adequately. So this being a biology department, we have to talk a little bit about biological evolution. Okay, the blood sacrifice to Satan will be tomorrow night at midnight. Clothing is optional, but please bring a cat and a kitchen knife. Actually, I'm kidding. The name you get associated with evolution is Charles Darwin, or as I like to call him, Chuck D. He was not the first to come up with a theory of evolution. Evolution is simply change over time. Evolution is to biology what history is to the human sciences. And just as you can't understand the way things are now in, let's say, American society and politics without understanding how they came to be that way, you can't fully understand anything in biology without knowing something about how it came to be that way. And Darwin was not the first to propose, he was not the first to propose the idea that life had changed over time. Okay, sorry, I heard a ding dong, but looks like nobody has joined. But the mechanism that he proposed that caused evolution to happen is called natural selection, and he basically got it right. There's an awful lot of modifications that we've made, things that we understand that Darwin did not, refinements to the mechanisms of change and so on, but he basically got the fundamental mechanism right. And it goes like this. I'm assuming you've all had this before in 1440 or 1441, but it always bears repeating. In any population of any species, individuals vary. We're all different from each other. You could go out in your lawn and start looking at clover plants, and every individual clover would be different if you could spend enough time looking at it carefully. Whether it's people or clovers or bacteria in your gut or anything else, in any population, individuals vary. Variation is inherited. The individuals somehow transmit their variant traits to any offspring that they have. We now understand this in terms of genetics. In Darwin's time, this was not understood. Nobody knew anything about genes. It would be nearly 100 years before DNA was worked out. And if you actually read Darwin's book on the subject, on the origin of species, he goes flailing around quite a bit because he has no idea how heredity works. But then, to be fair, neither does anybody else. The guy who would provide a big piece of the puzzle, Gregor Mendel, was still a monk and biology teacher in the city of Brno in what's now the Czech Republic, and was only beginning to do his pea crossing experiments. But even if you don't understand genetics, you can see this in your own family. You inherit traits from your parents. If you have kids, that you will pass the trait, some traits, onto your kids. If you don't pass your traits onto your kids, it might be time for some very difficult questions. But let's not go there. Individuals somehow transmit their traits to any offspring they've got. Any species, in theory, can increase its population exponentially. You start with 2 bunny rabbits, assume they're the same sex. No, assume they're opposite sexes. Same sex won't get you much. You will end up eventually with 4 bunny rabbits, and then with 8, and then 16, and 32, 64, 128. The population will grow exponentially. And in theory, it could keep doing this indefinitely, but we never see this indefinite increase in nature. Populations can bob up and down and zig and zag, but they tend to hold roughly constant or at least stay within certain limits. The conclusion to that is that not all of the offspring that are produced can survive. A single female, well, a female oyster can produce something on the order of 100 million eggs every season. And if she's not picked up and served on a half shell, she might live for 20 years. So if one female oyster can produce 2 billion offspring in her lifespan, if every one of those offspring survived, the ocean would rapidly fill up with oyster shells and there'd be no room for anything else. Since this has not happened, the only conclusion is that most of those baby oysters, in fact, almost all of them, don't live to grow up. Almost all of those babies die. It's a little bit less stark in longer-lived, slower breeding species, but not every baby sea turtle makes it to the surf. Not every adorable baby dolphin grows up to become an adorable grown-up dolphin with rather horrifying sex habits that I won't get into. I should not have even brought that up. Sometime in this class, I'm going to completely change the way you feel about dolphins, I'm afraid. Right. Not all offspring that are produced can survive. It's not mathematically possible. That means that there is a metaphorical struggle for existence going on. Don't read too much into that word struggle. It's not necessarily what you think of as fighting. If we have, let's say, trees in a forest, it is true that not every acorn is going to be capable of growing into an oak tree, and many of those acorns will sprout into saplings that will get shaded out or stepped on or eaten by something else. That does not mean that the oak trees are punching each other, right? They're not being violent about it. They're not ents, right? It's not like they're beating up on Saruman at Isengard or anything. Oh, that would be cool, but yeah, don't ever do what I do. Don't ever go into a showing of the Two Towers and watch the Ents marching on Isengard and yell, "Run, Forrest, run!" Right, anyhow, yeah, don't ever do that. So even though trees are not beating each other up, there's still only so much sunlight available per square foot of forest, and trees that don't manage to grab enough sunlight to survive will never grow tall and may eventually die, or not gain enough energy to produce much in the way of acorns. So even though the struggle is not necessarily physical combat, there are still more organisms that want resources than there are resources available, whether that's food, water, or sunlight per square foot, whatever it is. Now we know that individuals vary. Some individuals in any population will vary in ways that increase the probability that they will not only survive, but survive long enough to reproduce. Right. If we have a population of fish in the sea and there's a shark, some of those fish may be able to swim just a little bit faster than others. Or some of those fish might be just a little bit better at hiding than others. Or some of those fish might be big enough that the shark decides that it wants smaller and weaker prey. Some of those fish might be better at staying in the shark's blind spots until they can cap it with an AK-47. I don't know. Okay, not the AK-47 part, but some of those fish in the pool with the shark will vary in ways that give them better chances of surviving the shark and living to have babies. Others will vary in ways that decrease their odds. Maybe they are slower fish, or maybe they are more bright and colorful fish, or maybe they are colossally stupid fish. Ooh, shark, hey, I'm gonna make friends. You know, one way or another, they will vary in ways that decrease their chances. Darwin concluded that if all these are true, and they pretty much are, over several generations, some traits in a population will become common. Other traits will become more rare or disappear. Given enough time, separate populations of a species may end up becoming so different from each other that we may consider them different species. Okay, how does this work in the ocean? One way that has attracted attention is natural selection caused by human activity. Now, humans take advantage of, heredity and selection all the time when they do artificial selection. When you grow a lot of plants, let's say you pick out the ones that are prettiest, or the ones that provide the most food, or the ones that taste best. Let those breed and get rid of the rest, wash, rinse, and repeat. You can create crop plants by deliberate artificial selection, and people have been doing that ever since the origin of agriculture. But there are cases where human activity causes our natural selection without humans realizing it. And there's a couple of examples. There are a number of fish populations that are sexually maturing at an earlier age and smaller size than they used to. The average age of maturity of Atlantic cod used to be about 7 years back in 1960. As of 2010, it's gone down to 4.5 years. The fish aren't growing as large before their gonads mature and they start reproducing. The same is true for American plaice. That's I believe the plaice is a flatfish, kind of like flounder or sole. Also very delicious. And the age of maturity has gone down fairly steadily from 11 years down to 7. Why is this? Fishermen tend to take the larger fish. That could be, depending on what you're catching, that could just be, catching a bunch of fish and then throwing back the ones that are below the legal limit. Sometimes nets have holes of a certain size, and fish that are smaller than the size can get out, and fish that are larger can't. So the upshot is, if you are a very big cod, there is a pretty good chance that you'll get caught and turned into fish and chips, which used to be the main thing that they used to do with cod. We'll talk about Atlantic cod later. It's kind of a rough story. If you are a small cod, you have a greater chance of getting thrown back, and you get to reproduce. So if you reproduce quickly, while you're still small, you will have more babies than if you take a longer time to reproduce and you get large. Right? If you wait to reproduce until you've gotten really large and you wait 7 years, let's say, then there's a pretty good chance you'll get caught and turned into fish fingers before you ever reproduce at all. On the other hand, if you can let your gonads mature when you're small, if you can start puberty early and go through it quickly, you'll never reach a really large size, but you've got better chances of having babies. And we've seen this in several species of fish that are heavily exploited. I've seen this with other species as well. We've known about this for at least 20 years, that size at maturity in a number of species like this is dropping, and it's because of unintentional natural selection imposed by people. Nobody wants this, right? You want to have, big, tasty fish, but as an unintended consequence of fishing policy, it's happened. Another example that came out of, this is kind of neat. They took data from fishing rodeos in the Gulf of Mexico. People will go out, try to catch the largest fish that they can, and whoever's got the biggest marlin or the biggest shark or whatever it is wins a prize. I guess in freshwater they've got bass fishing tournaments that work along the same lines. So they gathered data they actually gathered some of this data from pictures of people posing with these giant sharks that they just caught. You can get your picture taken, standing and smiling right next to this dead shark being hung up by its tail. It's kind of a trophy for your time spent fishing. And so the scientists that looked at this were able to measure the size of large sharks. And the size goes up beginning in 1948, probably because equipment gets better and it gets easier to land the really big ones. But the size started going down in about 1988. And that coincided with a huge spike in longline commercial fishing. Down there at the bottom, that graph shows the commercial shark catch. And you can see it really spiked in about 1998. Sorry, that's 88, not 98. So you see what happened here. There was a big spike in tiger shark fishing. Commercial fishing primarily caught the large ones. So the large ones didn't get to have babies because they ended up getting hauled onto a commercial fishing vessel and probably turned into fake scallops or something like that. That left the smaller ones who were likelier to be rejected and go on to have babies themselves. So yeah, this spike in commercial fishing actually caused a change in the size of trophy fish that they could measure. So that's a bit of natural selection for you. I have to step out on land for a bit. In 1928, a German chap by the name of Ernst Mayr, who I was about to say he died recently, and I just realized it was 15 years ago. But yeah, he died at 101. He was really one of the grand old men of the field and kept writing books and doing research until right up to his death. But as a young man, seen here on the right, he marched off to New Guinea to study a family of birds known as birds of paradise. Birds of paradise were of considerable interest to Europeans at the time because many of them have very large and colorful and beautiful feathers. Many of the feathers were in demand by hat makers at the time. This is the time when ladies are wearing very fancy hats with big plumes of feathers on them, and that's fashionable. So an awful lot of birds of paradise are getting shot, unfortunately. But there's interest in trying to figure out how many species there are and where they live, and what factors of their biology could we use in order to shoot more of them and make them into expensive ladies' hats. So he went off and ended up shooting 3,000 birds of paradise. You could get away with this sort of thing back then. And I mean, he stuffed all of them and they're in museum collections now. So we can still learn something from them. But in this day and age, you generally can't do that kind of intensive specimen collecting. Those were different times. And he was baffled at the diversity that he found. This is called Dicrurus paradisus, but it's not technically a bird of paradise. It's in a different family, I think. But it shows you what he was up against. This bird varies over its geographic range, but it's not obvious how you might divide it. Right? Instead of having, one population of birds with big feathers and one with small feathers, there are populations with everything from almost no feathers to great big plumes on their heads. And it's not really clear where there's any real dividing line where you can divide this up. So we have a very variable species, but it doesn't have obvious places to divide it. Meyer realized that you couldn't define species based solely on what they look like, on shape or color, all of the features that your Audubon bird book would use. And he devised the biological species concept, which is probably what you've been exposed to in previous classes. A species is defined as a set of populations that potentially can interbreed. If the members of two populations cannot successfully interbreed, and by successfully I mean cannot produce fertile offspring, then we call them separate species. If they can interbreed, we call them the same species. Now, there can be, and if you take my evolution class, you'll hear a lot more about this, there can be an awful lot of slop in this definition. It's not uncommon to find two populations that rarely interbreed, but occasionally do, and the hybrids are fertile. So you can have two populations that are mostly separate, but genes from one are kind of trickling into the other. That's a phenomenon called introgression. So you can find gray areas here, and gray areas are what we would expect in a world that is undergoing evolution. When I was a grad student in Berkeley, California, Berkeley has this reputation of being ridiculously, freakishly liberal, and in many ways that's well-deserved, but for exactly that reason, it tends to attract a lot of people on the far opposite end of the spectrum. And you know how we get preachers coming on the campus maybe once a semester? You ever been here when one of them gets up and starts complaining about how all our male students are homosexual and all our female students are sluts? And I think to myself, wait a minute, how does that even work? Like, if all of our male students are gay, why are the female students even... Anyway, never mind. So yeah, you are familiar with this sort of people. We had people like that every day. We had people like that that make our homegrown evangelists look like complete noobs. And one of them, we used to have these kind of back alley debates about evolution and creation. And one of the points he tried to make was that if evolution is truly happening, then there'd be no way to classify species because everything would fade into everything else and we wouldn't have nice, neat divisions. And I said, you're right. Because, in fact, if you do try to do classification like this, you do encounter separate populations that are sort of separate species, but not quite, and populations that are mostly separate species, but not entirely, and populations that are mostly the same, but kind of look like they're starting to get different. The world is a lot fuzzier, and our attempts to classify it are unavoidably fuzzier than well, then I guess would be nice, but that's the kind of thing we get on a world of evolution, where we're seeing species that have separated but not completely. We get lots of in-between stages. So he's right. It is very hard to classify living things because sometimes this biological species concept criterion does not entirely work. But that's what you have to deal with in a world where the biosphere is evolving. Meyer proposed a model for how new species form, and it's called allopatric speciation. Allo is, well, it's how they answer the phone in France, but it's also Greek for allo. It's also Greek for different. And patria, in this case, means your homeland, right? If you love your patria, you are patriotic, where the word comes from. So allopatric means different homeland, different fatherland. And you start with a population of one species that gets split into two by a barrier that members cannot easily get across. There's two ways that that can happen. One way is you could have a population living in one place, and then some organisms get carried across a barrier to a new location. Maybe you have a species that lives on a mainland, and some of its members get, I don't know, picked up in a storm and blown to an island that is otherwise too far away for them to reach. We would call that process dispersal. The other possibility is the organisms don't move, but a barrier comes up within the population range. Found this out. They have detected genetic differences in garter snake populations on either side of major interstate highways. Right? The snakes are still where they always have been, but people created this barrier of a big highway with an awful lot of 18-wheelers and an awful lot of people who hate snakes. And snakes cannot easily get across that barrier. In nature, this could be, I'll show you a great marine example in just a minute, but in nature, this could be a river changing its course, the appearance of a mountain range because of volcanic activity or something like that. We call that vicariance. So in vicariance, the organisms stay where they are and a physical barrier appears that splits them. In dispersal, organisms live in one area and then some of them get transported to a new area across a barrier that they don't normally cross. That would be dispersal, right? So either way, one population of living things gets split into two. The separated populations will tend to become different. If they're in different environments, different food sources or different temperatures or whatever it is, selection will tend to make them become different. Each population will adapt to conditions in its environment. Alleles in one population can't be exchanged with the other because, as we say, gene flow is blocked. One population may be genetically different from the other purely by dumb luck. This is something called the founder effect. Populations will also diverge because they're going to change in different ways at random through a process called genetic drift. That's not listed on the slide, but it does happen. Genetic drift. Given enough time, the separate populations should become different enough that we can call them separate species. And in theory, even if that barrier disappears, and even if the two species come back into contact with each other, they won't interbreed. And you'll have two species instead of one. We've actually, let me think. Yeah, since the 50s, it's been possible to see some of these things happening in short-lived species like fruit flies. And I'll show you how we can work it out for other species. All right, there is North America up front. In pink, that's the United States. In yellow, we have Mexico. You see the islands of the Caribbean Sea. And Central America is usually defined as Mexico all the way down to Panama. So we've got Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, all the way down to South America. And of course, today we've got the Panama Canal dug across the Isthmus of Panama, but for our purposes, we don't need to worry about that. Now, we talked about plate tectonics, this crazy idea that the continents are on these tectonic plates that are moving. South America was a giant island until roughly 4 million years ago. What happened was, first of all, South America started getting close to North America. And second of all, a big subduction zone opened up where a plate called the Cocos Plate has been sinking under the North American plate. And so you have an arc of volcanoes. Everything from Guatemala down to Panama, there's lots of volcanoes in this area, and they do sometimes erupt, and sometimes they do cause terrible loss of life. I seem to recall there was a really big one in Guatemala back in the 70s. I know there's some beautiful ones in Costa Rica. You can go up and explore the cloud forests if you're ever down that way. So yeah, this land is relatively new, and a lot of it was built up by volcanoes. But up till a couple million years ago, it wasn't there, and there was open ocean between the Caribbean Sea on the right and the North Pacific Ocean on the left. So what did that do? Well, if you start collecting seashells, as an old friend of mine did, you start finding things like this. On the right, that is the common name for it is the fighting conch, C-O-N-C-H, Strombus pugilis. I actually picked one of these up on the beach when we went to visit friends in Puerto Rico when I was 4. So, I've always liked this species because it's kind of associated with a formative moment in my distant childhood. And then when I got older and visited the Pacific coast of Mexico, I actually picked up some Strombus gracilior. Now, the proportions are a little bit different. The size is about the same. The proportions are a little different. There's other minor differences, but what you can see is that they look an awful lot alike. What happened is that before the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, there was just one species living in both the Caribbean and in the North Pacific. When the isthmus formed, that one species got split into 2. The 2 species now look different, but you can still see that they're very similar to each other. They're a pair of very closely related species. When I was in grad school, we actually, a good friend of mine was working on, well, this. He was looking at similarities between Pacific and Caribbean species of another type of snail called limpets. Little cone-shaped things that don't have coils on their shell. They just look like little peaks. And a couple of spring breaks, we would all pile into a car and spend our time driving down to the Gulf of California, driving down to the Baja California Peninsula of Mexico, and doing some recreational marine biology. And I would just tag along and help out if I could. But my friend would go scuba diving and collect these limpets and preserve them and take shrooms and come back and analyze their DNA, which was was still kind of a new thing in 1996. And he found the same pattern, that limpets on the Pacific coast of Mexico, their closest genetic relatives were limpets in the Caribbean Sea. And you find the same pattern with other species. Purpura patula is the Caribbean rock snail. Purpura panza is the Pacific rock snail. And again, there's pretty minor differences between the two. And the simplest explanation for why you have very similar pairs of species in the Pacific as opposed to the Caribbean is that these two species come from a common ancestor that lived in both the Pacific and the Caribbean back before the barrier of the Isthmus of Panama came up. And since that barrier has arisen, the formation of this dry land by volcanic activity, the ancestral population was split into two. Both of those populations have changed a bit, but not so much that you can't still see their similarity. The same would be true for things like the Caribbean deer cowrie, Cypris cervus, the Pacific deer cowrie, Cypris cervinetta. And the same is true for those limpets, and the same is true for a lot of critters. If you look at the marine life on the Pacific coast of Mexico, the most similar species tend to be the ones in the Caribbean on the opposite side of the Isthmus of Panama. And that's because they used to be the same species, and then the Isthmus of Panama formed, splitting the ancestral species into two. Okay, you with me there? Everything copacetic. Ruby. So Chuck D realized that if evolution's true, it gives you a new basis for classification. As he put it, our classifications will come to be, insofar as they can be made, genealogies. They'll be family trees. We will classify things not because of necessarily what they look like, but whether we can support the hypothesis that they came from a common ancestor. The example I always use here in Biology 1400 is, I guess they don't make phone books these days, but when I moved here, I got the white pages for Conway, and I looked through it once, and there were about 20 Freyaldenhovens in the phone book. This town is crawling with Freyaldenhovens. What? Two spellings of it? Dang, wow. Wow, that's evolutionary diversification. So yeah, you've got Freyaldenhoven heating and cooling, Freyaldenhoven's greenhouse. The neurologist my wife had to go to once years ago was Dr. Freyaldenhoven. You know, this is like Freyaldenhoven Central. Now, you could come up with a lot of explanations for that. Maybe a bunch of people in Conway who were completely unrelated just decided they liked the name. But the simplest hypothesis is that some guy named Freyaldenhoven moved here and had lots of kids, and they had lots of kids, and they inherited the last name, right? Your simplest explanation for why this town is loaded with Freyaldenhovens is because they're all descended from a common ancestor. And you could work out that common ancestor's family tree. In fact, I'm sure people have done it. And using the same logic, you can try to classify organisms based on whether they're likely to be descended from common ancestors. And if you could see the way that all living things are related to each other, it would look like an enormous tree, starting from whatever the first life form was, some sort of primordial globule or something like that. It doesn't really matter what it was, but starting with that as the root and diversifying, splitting into new species, evolving new features by natural selection, changing over unimaginably long periods of time. If you could see all of that process taking place through geological time, it would look like an enormous tree. Buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch. So I believe it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. Reading Darwin is kind of like watching a chess game. If you know what he's getting at, it can be tremendously exciting to watch him build his arguments. If you're not already kind of invested in it, it gets pretty dull. I mean, like, if you know chess game can be incredibly exciting. If you don't, it's a couple of geeks staring at each other and periodically picking up something and moving it, right? Okay, his writing is kind of the same, but this is one of the few places where he actually lets himself get a little bit poetic. And I was going to go on from there and start talking about how we can know what this tree of life might actually look like. But it is actually later than I thought it was going to be, so I'm going to call a halt there, and we will pick this up on Friday. All right, any questions from the live audience? Let me see, do we have any questions from the, do we have any questions from Internet world? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions from Internet land. And I'm going to have to get out of here, or Dr. Austin is going to probably come in and shoot me, because he's in here next. So thank you much, and I will see you next time. And I'll stop recording.